€50,498.42. Text play to 57557. Get your entry in by 3 o'clock tomorrow, and then across the Go Loud network of stations, Barry Dunn will make the call. If your phone rings, answer within 5 rings. The exact amount in euro and cents, and the cash is yours. So again, the new amount is €50,498.42. Over 18s only. Text costs €2.50. And you're playing across the Go Loud network of stations. Terms and conditions on newstalk.com.
The Football Show on Off the Ball.
With Sky. All the football you love in one place. Across Sky Sports, BT Sport and Premier Sports.
This is Newstalk.
I'm prepared to do anything I can to play for my country again.
Do it then.
What about your start to the game? It wasn't bad, was it?
Why should an honest answer be a mistake?
How can a modern day manager not have a mobile phone?
Why should he?
Oh.
Now you're welcome on to the Football Show. Latest this evening, 0-0 between Newcastle and Leicester. Second half is just getting underway. Later on this evening, we will talk to Graham Hunter. Vinicius Junior once again, and it is very much once again, subjected to the most pernicious, vicious, racist abuse in a stadium. Carlo Ancelotti said afterwards, he was furious afterwards actually. Ancelotti was aghast that the interviewer on Spanish television wanted to talk about football with him. He said the game should have been abandoned. Vinicius was in tears on the pitch. It's incredibly upsetting. We're talking about a 22-year-old. And he took to Instagram once again afterwards to talk about his disgust with the situation, which just seems to go on unchecked largely. Although Graham, as you'll hear later on in our conversation, is a touch more optimistic than he often is when we discuss the racism around Vinicius with him, on account of the public outcry across Spain on the back of this latest episode. So Graham will explain all in due course. But first, we did want to talk about the Premier League weekend that was. Very happy to say football writer Jonathan Wilson is once again with us. Good evening, very welcome, Jonathan.
Evening, how are you doing?
Very well. I did note that the weekend started with yet another defeat for Spurs at the hands of Brentford. Harry Kane scored goal number 28. What a weird place in his career. So misses crucial penalty at World Cup for England, their best chance perhaps of winning the World Cup in his career. The club has fallen down all around him, and he scores 28 goals, which is one shy of his best ever season, and yet next to Erling Haaland it looks like something quaint of a bygone era. So I don't know. I'm so curious to see what becomes of Kane over the next 2-3 years. Is your sense it's very much Old Trafford?
I don't know, to be honest. I think sort of 6 weeks, 2 months ago, you might have thought Manchester United was a more attractive prospect than it looks now. I'm not even convinced he wants to leave. I think the fact he stayed at Tottenham so long suggests to me that there is something deep within him would prefer to stay at Tottenham if he felt there was a reasonable chance of progress, of winning something. He's obviously getting to an age where those decisions have a bit more urgency about them. I don't think anybody could say, I mean, I guess, the world being what the world is, the most blinkered Tottenham fans could turn on him and, accuse him of having betrayed the club or whatever. But, he's given the club everything that you could realistically expect from somebody. It's about time they gave him something back. And, this season, the fact he scored 28 goals in a terrible season for Tottenham, you think, how bad would they have been without him? Where would they have been without those goals?
All the more reason Daniel Levy will say, no.
Well, yeah.
You're staying, pal.
And the thing is, if you get rid of Kane, what are you building the team around? Yeah. It's not like, this does happen when teams are out of form. You suddenly start looking at players and thinking, is anybody going to be upset if he leaves? Kane's the only one, really, I think, where people will be upset if he goes. I guess maybe Bentancur, but obviously he's had the injury problems, and he has the benefit of youth. But there's not a lot of players there who are popular or really deserve to be popular on recent form. Son clearly was one this time last season. You just said they absolutely desperately want to keep him. He's had an awful season. He's clearly a really good player, but he's of an age now where you think, well, maybe that's it. Maybe he's gone past his peak and he's on the downward slope and he's not going to get back. Maybe next season he comes out and scores 20 goals again. But it's hard on recent performances to make that case. And then for Kane, does he go to United? There's a sort of strong English core there that maybe would attract him. I guess everybody now. I think one of the arguments to not go to Manchester United in the past was it's very difficult to gain personal glory from that. When Robin van Persie went there, he had a great season, but he was just continuing the United juggernaut. Yeah, it's another trophy won, another box ticked. For him, it was great because he won trophies he hadn't won at Arsenal. But Kane going there, it is different that United have had the decade without success now, and so to be the player who maybe could bring them back to glory, I guess that is attractive. Having said that, United's still a million miles off City, so maybe I guess that maybe is a thing to keep him at Tottenham. But going to City when that was on the table last year, you were joining probably the best club in Europe. That was an almost guarantee of success. He goes to Manchester United. The situation might not be that different to Tottenham. Yeah. He might be the leading light in a team that's struggling to reach the heights it hopes to hit.
It's a fair point. So weekend started with Spurs, finished obviously with City, as you've alluded to. Now the title race, the air was let out of the tyres the night that City beat Arsenal. It was well and truly flat by this weekend, obviously, but they celebrated and there was a pitch invasion and all those good things. Put into context, and some of this is subjective as opposed to facts and figures. Put into context City's current dominance in English football. Obviously in the 80s there was Liverpool. I think it was 6 and 8 years at one stage in the 80s, and then more recently Ferguson's United, I think 8 and 13 years, and 4 out of 5 years at one stage as well in his third and final great team. So it's beyond the numbers, I suppose, when we're trying to assess the most dominant team that we've seen in English football. Where does this City group, and I appreciate they're not done yet, where do they fit into that conversation in your eye, Jonathan?
I mean, they are the most dominant. I don't think there's any question about that. They're only the sixth team to win 3 in a row. They're only the third team to win 5 in 6 years. Ferguson's United and the great Liverpool being the other two. But if you look at the points tallies, the Liverpool one, it's slightly harder because I think the first 3 or first 4 years of that were under 2 points for a win. So it's not just a case of scaling that up because obviously incentives are different. But if you just compare it to Manchester United of the late 90s, it's a couple of weeks since I've done the maths on this, but and I guess it would be higher now because City have kept winning. But if you project out this season in terms of points per game, City then were on course to get, I think it was 17.1% more points than United got over those 6 seasons. So you're 17%, well, more, 18, 19% by now, better, more dominant than the previous most dominant team in history. So that's really pretty dominant.
And beyond points, because I do
which is
your,
a fair point.
Yeah, but I take your point, not to keep saying the word point over and over again. And how does it feel emotionally, their dominance in comparison with, say, United or Liverpool?
Well, yeah, I think that's. I guess there's 2 elements to that. So one is you say, from a football point of view, why are they dominant? They're dominant because they've got great players. They spend a lot of money, but you compare it to other teams at the top. They haven't spent extraordinary amounts compared to certainly Chelsea in the last year, or Manchester United or Arsenal or Liverpool or whoever. Yeah. They have spent. I think in terms of transfer fees, I think they've spent less than about half a dozen teams over the last 7 years. Wages is a different story. But the point is that over 15 years, they have consistently spent a huge amount of money, and they've constructed a club very cleverly. They've spent the money well. There hasn't been much wastage there. but they identified very early that Pep Guardiola was the best coach in Europe. They appointed Ferran Soriano and Chiqui Begiristain to Barcelona directors to sort of prepare the ground for him, and everything has been set up for him. So the question then is, what happens when Guardiola goes? And I suspect they will continue to be dominant, but probably not this dominant. I mean, that's the pattern we saw with Barcelona, that we've seen with Bayern. Pep Guardiola, whatever you think of him as a person, whatever you think of various things in his past, he's a brilliant football coach. Probably in our lifetimes, the greatest coach. And yet people say, oh yeah, but he couldn't do it with Tranmere or Walsall or Sunderland or whoever. Yeah, but so what? None of the great coaches did it with those clubs. Not in the last 50 years. So it's a slightly fallacious argument. When we talk about the great coaches, obviously coaching Manchester City is a very different job to coaching Walsall, but he's not being asked to coach Walsall. He's being asked to coach Manchester City, and he's doing it incredibly well. So I think that domination may fade as and when he goes. I don't. We often hear rumours towards the end of the season Guardiola's sort of thinking about his future. I'm not aware of any whisper around that subject at the minute. So I think we can assume he's there for 2 or 3 years more at least. I mean, he is a very intense figure. It does seem to sort of take it out of him. Certainly that was his experience at Barcelona. Maybe because of his emotional investment there, maybe that makes it slightly different. But yeah, when Guardiola goes, they will come back towards the pack. But that financial domination is, okay, Newcastle and Saudi Arabia, a Qatari takeover of a club, should that be Manchester United or maybe somebody else, may challenge that. But they are wealthy beyond anything else we've seen in football, and that gives them a whole number of advantages. So this stat that City fans love to come out with, they're only, I think it's the sixth, but they've got the 6 hours net spend since 2016. Well, yes, but if they needed to, they could spend more. So they've always got that safety net. If other teams start a challenge, spend a bit more. They can go bigger. They can afford to fail as well. If they make a £100 million signing, it doesn't work. Yeah, they move on. If Liverpool do that, it's a big problem for them. Yeah. And then you have this issue of 115 Premier League charges. Admittedly, they took place a long time ago, but that's how they were able to bridge the gap from where they were to where they are now, that period. So those are consequential to what's happening now. And I think the bigger worry is, and this is true of all of the state projects, it's true of PSG and it's true of Newcastle, they have such wealth that they're essentially ungovernable by football's authorities. That if the football authorities bring charges against them, if they find them guilty, these clubs can afford to pay the very best lawyers to challenge those decisions, and they can make them last a long time, and they can run down the resources of the governing bodies, and they can cost those governing bodies enormous amounts of money. And that makes it very, very hard to regulate. And I have a certain sympathy with both UEFA and the Premier League in trying to do that.
Come to the charges in just one moment, because they're such an integral part of this story. But if we're assessing this latest City League win, you touched there on something which is so admirable about the way that they have gone about their business, and the other side of the ledger under less admirable is pretty hefty as well, don't get me wrong, but there is almost something like traditional, Ferguson-esque about the way that they have made Guardiola the most important person at the club. He doesn't want Cancelo. They say, fine, you are truly the boss, Cancelo goes. And he is so exceptional. They have recognised that. Like in some respects, the best thing they have done is to have the good sense to realise just how great Guardiola is and stay out of the way. And that might sound like not the most complicated thing to have arrived at, but geez, turns out it's rarer than you think. Like there is like a super intelligent group there to recognise, let the genius work, put him in charge.
Yeah, and his support staff and Soriano and Begiristain. Yeah, I mean, you're right, it's not complicated, and yet the history of wealthy owners tells you they very rarely do that. They want to be involved. They want to, you're Chelsea. You've got a manager who's won the Champions League, for the club. A year earlier, you say, oh yeah, he's the man that we're going to, we're going to allow him to make the big decisions. He's the expert, and you spend £250 million for him, and then 7 days after the window closes, actually he's not the man for us. Sorry, we got that wrong. We'll just spend another £350 million in January. I mean, that's not a way to run anything. You look even at City when they had the Chinawatra little spell before Sheikh Mansour came in, and that spending then was very, very odd. But once they worked out, Barcelona are the club we want to emulate. Let's bring in 2 Barcelona directors. Let's let them sort it out. Yeah, that's the cleverest way of doing things. Newcastle, to be fair to them, I think they've started off pretty impressively. There haven't been any Robinho style signings. They've it's incremental, the improvement, which is I think the way you have to do it. You don't want one of your players to be 10 times as good as everybody else, and you have to pay him 10 times as much money. That's not a recipe for success. Yeah. And PSG are the great warning. If you can spend an enormous amount of money, you can win the league every year. And as soon as you get into a competition where you have other mildly wealthy clubs who can challenge you, it turns out you're useless. Yeah.
Can I put you in the impossible position of trying to speak on behalf of maybe 50 million people? Are City hated in the way that stand up if you hate Man United at England games was a go-to?
That's really hard to answer.
Yeah.
I think football generally is different now to how it was. I think people are so wrapped up in their own clubs and their own antagonisms. And this is a very sort of it's almost a navel-gazing point. But it's astonishing when if I raise a question about Qatar maybe taking over Manchester United, and I suddenly get Manchester United fans going, "Oh, why didn't you say this when it was Newcastle? Why didn't you say this when it was City?" Have you read anything I've written in the last 15 years? And of course, the truth is they haven't, because they just read about Manchester United. Why would they be reading me on other things?
Yes.
So I think to an extent there's a degree of not ignorance, but it just doesn't impinge on people to that extent. In terms of the ownership, I think there's a frustration now that, as with United in the 90s, that they're so dominant. I think the other thing that's changed in terms of fandom is it's much more international now. And I think the way fandom was constructed in the 90s was still very much you tend to support your local team. One of the reasons that Manchester United, or one of the sticks you used to beat Manchester United with, maybe is a better way of putting it, was that their fans were not from Salford, not from Manchester. I don't think that's necessarily true of City yet, but they obviously do have a lot of fans from overseas, particularly. You get a lot of Ivorians, for instance, support them because of Yaya Toure, which is totally reasonable, makes a lot of sense. I think we're much more familiar with that idea, much more comfortable with that idea now of a global fan base. And I think that slightly dilutes that.
Yes.
Having said that, I've been really struck, having written a couple of pieces over the last couple of weeks, trying to put City into context of how great are they? How do they compare to Manchester United's treble winners? If they do go on to win the treble, or we were talking about the 6 teams to have won the league 3 times in a row. And even though I'll mention somewhere, because I think you have to mention it, the fact they're facing 115 charges of all the disquiet and the discomfort about the ownership, you put out a tweet about it, and you get a load of responses now going, "What about the charges? What about?" Well, it is there in the piece if you actually read it. Yeah. But the fact that is now the knee-jerk reaction, whereas I would say even a year ago, the knee-jerk reaction was the other way, of City fans going, "Why can't you give us credit?" I think that's interesting. I think that suggests there is a mounting sense of unease. And I think the charges actually probably have brought that to the surface. Yeah. There's a feeling that the Premier League would not have brought those charges unless they had deep concerns, that they wouldn't risk the reputation of a competition unless there's a very, very serious case to be answered, whether they end up being found guilty or not.
Well, that's as a final thought as the clock comes against us. That is what's so dispiriting about the whole thing now. Premier League would not bring these charges against their own champions unless they were deeply confident that rules had been broken in a major way, and 115 charges at that. And City responded at the time by saying, we have irrefutable evidence which proves our innocence. I mean, if you really have irrefutable evidence, like, rather than drawing this thing out over several years, a quick email where you condense down that irrefutable evidence might be pretty helpful for both you, because, this league win and any future league wins are completely tarnished at the moment. Most of us are sitting here with our hands crossed, and you can't even assess them properly until we have a verdict. But I think the most dispiriting thing about all of this is at the end of the 2, 3 or 4 years, Jonathan, and such is the world at large, we will reach a point where, regardless of the verdict, City will maintain their innocence, as will their fans, and it will just be this big, horrible, dirty mess. And that's the lot of the Premier League at the moment.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that point you make about it being impossible to assess them, it's absolutely true. I mean, I tried to do that in The Guardian on Saturday and found that the whole way I couldn't see anything apart from 115 charges. Yeah. And it's the idea that I think even if they are innocent on all these counts, I think there's something very dispiriting about that ownership. It is something very it's just bad for football to have state-owning clubs, because it makes us, as I said before, it makes the clubs very, very hard to regulate. Which is why I really hope this is an example of football's governing bodies being able to regulate. So I really hope whichever way the decision goes, it's clear cut.
Yes.
What we don't want is something as happened with UEFA, where essentially they're guilty of a lot of these, but they're time barred, so we can't, and then having at the end fining them, UEFA fined them for not cooperating with the inquiry. Well, if you do have irrefutable evidence, you cooperate every step, and what you don't do is go, that KC who's running this, he's an Arsenal fan. No, that's not irrefutable evidence. That's the. It's playground stuff. It's appealing to sort of the most vocal and virulent, City fans on the internet, to give them, it's red meat to them. Something to, this whole process was flawed. How can we have to get a fair hearing when one of the KCs running it is an Arsenal fan? Yeah,
I think that's exactly where we're headed. Unfortunately, we are out of time. Cheery chat. Good to lay out the land. I think it's important to do that routinely. Thanks so much. Appreciate it, though.
Cheers.
Cheers. Jonathan Wilson with us as Manchester City officially win their 5th title in 6 years. Latest in the Premier League, Newcastle 0-0 at home to Leicester, 65 minutes on the clock. And our football show coverage is brought to you by Sky. You can watch all the football you love, including the biggest Premier League games every weekend, live on Sky. We have Graham Hunter with us next.
Football on Off the Ball
with Sky, proud partner and supporter of the Republic of